Okay. Great. Well, thanks very much for joining me. I'm here this afternoon or this morning because I've heard that Western Australia has got a serious problem, that your requirement specifications are pretty terrible, your technical designs are flawed, and your project plans are an illusion to mask your uncertainty. And you're making yourselves miserable, you're delivering late, you're going over budget, and I'd love to show you a way that perhaps we can fix it. So this is a workshop called Estimating Business Applications, and I'm going to try and show you how you can use what is called a user story map to define the scope, the priorities, the timeline, and the costs for a business applications project in just a couple of hours or a couple of days, much quicker than a traditional analysis and design exercise that will hopefully win funding for your projects almost every time. It's a good workshop whether you're a business analyst in pre-sales, whether you're in sales actually, project manager, practice leader, developers, architects, testers, functional consultants can all get something out of this workshop today. And it's I'm going to use some examples from a Dynamics 365 project team, but works just as well for Power Apps and Power BI applications. Tends to work better for complex enterprise applications. If you're building a simple Power App for your team, you probably don't need to go to these kind of lengths to estimate them and win approval, right? So you're just maybe doing an app with a couple of people on your own, and this kind of approach is maybe not necessary for that. Okay, my name is Neil Benson. I run Customery, and I'm on a mission to help Microsoft customers and partners build amazing Agile Dynamics 365 and Power Platform applications. I've been working with business software for about 20 years with a focus on customer relationship management. And for the first 10 years, really, I was a business analyst on a mission to write the perfect requirement specification, but I never got there. Actually, for the last 10, 12 years, I've been using Scrum, where I haven't written requirement specs up front. I haven't written big design specifications up front either. I'm using an Agile approach where that's maybe not as necessary as it was in the past. Love to connect with you. I know some of the people in the Perth user group already, but if we haven't already connected, please reach out via LinkedIn or Twitter or send me an email if you want to connect. I've also got lots of content freely available at the Amazing Apps Show. So that's a podcast and a video channel on YouTube. The podcast is available on all major podcast players. You're welcome to send me your questions. I do try and address listener questions live recorded on the show or with a YouTube video. So if you're any questions about adopting an Agile approach or implementing it within your business, I'd love to hear from you. All right. It's going to be 5 parts to the workshop today. The first one is the project estimation crisis, because I think traditionally some of the approaches that we've taken to building business applications are the same that we took to building big buildings, right? Like the Opera House. And we run into trouble when we treat software projects like huge construction projects. This is my friend Dennis. Dennis is the CIO of Jurassic World. He's led the successful implementation of Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations a couple of years ago, and he's at the forefront of Jurassic World's transition to the cloud. He's a pretty all-up decent CIO. He also implemented a new dinosaur emergency response system after a little incident at the park last year. He's done a great job, and he'd like to retire in the next year or two, before he gets eaten. So he wants to do that, but the board has asked him to finish up with a field service project. So they want to deploy Dynamics 365 for field service so that Jurassic World can run all of its assets much more efficiently. They've got all these trucks and people who service the assets around the park, and we want to make them a lot more efficient. So the board has brought Dennis in, and they're going to ask him a couple of questions. The kind of thing that all of us get asked. They want to know what features you can deliver and by when, what resources he'll need, how much it's all going to cost. And so Dennis is going to go away and give the board those answers. And what he's done, first of all, he's assembled a delivery team, well, more of a discovery team, really, because they're going to analyze the requirements. So their job is to figure out what features are going to be needed, when those features will be ready, and the size and the cost of the delivery teams to meet this vision for field service at Jurassic World. What the team has gone away and done with a couple of business analysts is to write hundreds and hundreds of specifications or requirements. They've got a spreadsheet. It's got 1,865 lines in it. They're a mixture of use cases, user stories, system shall statements, business rules, a couple of questions thrown in there for good measure as well. It's got duplicates, inaccuracies, conflicting requirements. The requirements are different sizes, written in different styles by different people. It's a bit of a hot mess. If you've ever had to respond to an RFP with a bunch of functional requirements, it's a lot like one of those. I love number 5, the system shall require no user training. And yet number 10 says the vendor has got to provide all the user training, typical kind of requirements you get. And off the back of that requirement specification, the architects have gone away and come up with a bunch of design documents. This one, I don't have it. I don't have a system design document handy, so I pulled one from SureStep. This thing's about 10 years old. They've got solution architecture designs, a cloud network design. They've got entity relationship diagrams, sequence diagrams, lots of business process flows with to be and as is business processes. Again, there's lots of gaps and conflicting designs. Dennis is pretty sure that they're going to need offline access in some parts of the park. It's not mentioned anywhere in the design specifications. And then all of that is handed over to Ellie. Ellie is our intrepid project manager at Jurassic World. She's been there for about 15 years. She knows how complex their projects can get. So she's worked really hard with the analysts and the architects to capture every single task needed to deliver on every single requirement. And she's compiled all of that into her trusty Microsoft project Gantt chart. She's arranged those into phases, mapped out all the dependencies. To address the quality issues they've had in the past, Ellie has added strict stage gates and quality reviews in between the phases so that everything gets signed off before the next phase starts. And she's included 6 months worth of testing. She wants to test every single scenario so that she can deliver a defect-free solution to Jurassic World. The result of all of this is 346 pages of requirements documentation, 129 pages of design documentation, 2,613 tasks in a project plan that predicts it's going to take 2,432 days of effort, with the project starting on the 4th of March and being finished 9 months later on the 31st of December, because that's a really good day to go live. And implementation is going to cost $1,475.34 and a contingency of $525,257.11. How is that for precision? These transitions are a little slow between the slides. So the approach that Dennis's team has taken, this discovery team, has really taken the same approach that software development teams have done since complex software started getting built in the 1950s. It's the same way that we build skyscrapers or bridges or tunnels or shopping center or even an opera house like this one. This is Brickman, if you've ever seen Lego Master Builders on TV. This is Brickman, my little son, looking at the inside of the Sydney Opera House. We've been building big business buildings like these for hundreds, thousands of years maybe. We've only been building enterprise software applications for about 50 years. And when we try to use a similar approach, I think we come unstuck and things tend to get delivered late and overrun. While building architects can sometimes be asked to amend their building plans, changing requirements is much more common on software projects, and handling that change is something we need to deal with, and traditional approaches don't deal with it very well. Let's look at the requirement specification in a bit more detail, because it's the foundation on which that project plan was built. And if we're going to evolve away from the traditional Gantt chart, then perhaps we need to address some fundamental issues with our requirements. This is a business analyst, right? I was a business analyst for over 10 years. The business analyst is responsible for collecting and collating and documenting all of those requirements into a specification. And it's the BA's job. Well, it's a really conflicted job. You've got to write a requirement specification that is simple and short enough that your stakeholders can understand it and approve it, sign it off. And it's got to be long enough and detailed and technical enough that the developers can implement all those requirements in your business application, really, hopefully without any further workshops or anything that's necessary to get any missing details. It should all be in the specification. I've written requirements using use cases and user stories. I've organized lists of functional and non-functional requirements. I've done prioritization with Moscow, and I've started doing modeling with UML and entity relationship diagrams and the business process modeling notation, and all of these techniques to try and write the perfect requirement specification. But I didn't ever find it was possible. I don't think Shakespeare would find it easy to write a perfect requirement specification. The words just, in the English natural language, fail us sometimes. Let me show you some examples of how bad it, or how difficult it is to translate what you're looking for and have somebody else write it down, even when you're sitting together. Here's a couple of nice tattoos. Hopefully nobody in Perth has got tattoos like this. Only God can fudge me. Plan a heya. My favorite, needs an extra finger. Nothing lasts forever except a misplaced apostrophe. And no dream is too big. Oops, misspelling in there as well. Sounds like somebody on their way to Dreamforce. It's got a bad tattoo. So requirement specifications are a really tough spot for a business analyst to be put in. Build a project plan on top of a shaky foundation. And I don't think most project plans are worth the paper that they're written on. Project sponsors want to know exactly when the project will be done and exactly how much it's going to cost. And they think that a level of precision is useful, you know, to the nearest penny. But is it really? Is it possible to predict exactly how much a software project is going to cost? I'm not entirely convinced that it is. And responding with something that looks extremely precise is giving our stakeholders a misrepresentation of the truth. Whenever we present a Gantt chart like this one, it often starts out nice and simple. You can see different phases, and each phase leads into another phase in a pretty cascading sequence. And you might have heard of that term waterfall software development, because like the steps in this kind of waterfall, each phase kind of tumbles down into the next one. And unless your Dynamics 365 developers are like leaping salmon, you can't really go backwards. It's impossible to change the requirements once the design has been signed off. And once the design has been signed off, you really don't want to change the requirements in the middle of the development phase. And if you find a missing requirement in the deployment phase, well, so help you. The business analysts and the architects have all gone home. It's shockingly expensive to make changes late in our project when we're using an approach like this. So I want to put the Gantt chart to bed. Some people still love using Microsoft Project, and it is an awesome tool, but I don't think it's the best way for managing our applications, our business applications projects. I think the precision of the requirements is a fallacy, and not only are natural languages and diagrams a really difficult way to transmit our requirements from the users into the developers' heads, they're often written at the very beginning of the project. That's when the users know nothing about Dynamics 365 or Power Apps or Power BI. They might have seen a couple of demos, but they've probably never used it. And our developers might never have worked together, and they probably have never worked together with this group of users. So we're writing requirements at what I call the point of peak ignorance in our project. It's when everybody knows the least about what's going on. The reality is that there's a huge amount of uncertainty at the beginning of a project. So let's have a look at that uncertainty. There's a model called the cone of uncertainty, which illustrates that really well. And I'm going to show you why I think a margarita is much better than a glass of Sauvignon Blanc. And if I can, arrow keys don't work. All right, that's good to know. This is our glass of Sauvignon Blanc, the cone of uncertainty. And what it's saying here is that at the outset of the project, at the beginning of the analysis phase, the range of actual costs could be anywhere between 10 times and 1/10 of our estimate. By the way, it's never going to be a 10th. Unless your project got cancelled pretty early. The final costs are I've never seen a project budget. final project budget was 1/10 of the estimate. Our estimates get better over time as we go through the design, development, testing, and deployment phases. They get a little bit more accurate. But even halfway through the development phase, our final costs could be somewhere between half and twice our estimated costs. So let's spend a few minutes looking at ways we might reduce that uncertainty and give our stakeholders a little bit more certainty. One way of doing that is to add some padding, also known as contingency. So Ellie had added on a huge contingency percentage to her estimate, and that's a common reaction, especially when previous projects have gone over budget. Adding in that padding certainly lowers the risk of underestimation, but it's harder than it sounds. If you overestimate too much, if you add on too much padding, then your return on investment is at risk. If you've got too big a number, your stakeholders just won't approve the project. And if you go too low, you're likely to run out of money, which is really risky, especially if you're a Microsoft partner working on some kind of fixed price implementation. So let's avoid adding in contingency and adding padding to our projects. What other techniques do we have for reducing risk? Well, I think a much better way of handling requirements is to have a discussion instead of a specification. One of the biggest drawbacks, like we've seen, of using requirement specification is that natural languages are open to misinterpretation. We saw that with tattoos. I think having a discussion, bringing the actual developers together with the users in the same room to reach a mutual understanding is a much better approach to sorting out what the requirements are. One way of doing that is a technique called user stories. I've been working with user stories for 10 years. They're a very popular method now of capturing requirements, and they're really all about that collaboration between the developers and the users. We give the users a chance to express the requirements in their business language, and the developers a chance to clarify what the users mean so that we reach a more mutual understanding. Not a perfect understanding by any means, but a better understanding. And we're going to look at some user story examples in a little while. Another technique that we can use to reduce uncertainty is something called relative estimation. Absolute estimation is where we estimate, break everything down into tasks and estimate how long it's going to take, maybe to the nearest 15-minute increment. Relative estimation just compares the size of two things. Anybody recognize this country? It's New Zealand, good. It's 258,021 square kilometers, but I bet you were just about to say that. If I asked you to compare the size of New Zealand to Australia, what do you think is the relative size? Do you think Australia is 10 times bigger, 20 times bigger, 30 times bigger, 50 or 100 times bigger? Welcome to pop your idea into the chat. 10, 20, 30, 50 or 100. Well, those of you on Wikipedia right now will have discovered that Australia is 7.6 million square kilometers. Therefore, it's about 30 times bigger than New Zealand. Sorry, Olga, you were out by a couple of factors. Normally, humans are much better at estimating the relative size of two things rather than the absolute size of something. Another technique that we're going to use is called incremental funding. Rather than ask for all of the money that we need up front, we're going to ask for small chunks of investment as the project progresses. We're going to start out maybe with a proof of concept or a prototype. Then we're going to move on to a minimum viable product. And then we're going to go to release 1 and release 2 and release 3. We're gradually building up the capabilities that our users have got in production. And with each proven release, we're demonstrating value and we are asking for additional funding for the next phase. That's much less risky from a capital investment point of view. We're not having to set aside huge chunks of change for a long time. And CIOs and CFOs love this idea of incremental and iterative funding. And at any time, we can cut off funding. If we reach a point where it says, look, there's going to be no further return on investment, we've done really well, the returns are diminishing, we're going to put a hold on future investment after the next release, then that's great. Or if it's a bit of a disaster, we can cut off funding really early. And we don't have to wait months or years until we get into production to find out that this thing isn't quite what we expected. The next thing we can do is iterative development, which goes hand in hand with that idea of incremental funding as well. We're going to release a few features, build on that, and release a few more. Much easier for users to tell us what they don't like about a feature or what additions need to be made to an application, rather than just imagine what needs to be done when you're standing in front of a clean whiteboard. So we're going to go from something that starts out looking like a skateboard right up to a rocket rally car with an incremental approach. And the last technique, I think it's the last one that we can use, is something called forced rank prioritization. If you've ever built a requirement spreadsheet, you've probably had a priority column in it. It might be high, medium, or low. It could be a bit more sophisticated and use Moscow. So it's must, should, could, would kind of prioritization. What that doesn't do is tell the developers exactly where to start. So I'm not a big fan of using Moscow. What I would like to see is us ordering the priority of the requirements in a 1 to 100. So if we've got 100 requirements, then we order them 1 to 100 so that we know exactly what order and what the sequential business value is from this set of requirements. Much easier for developers to say, we're going to start with the wheels, then we're going to move on to the steering, now we're going to deliver the brakes, and so on, working down that set of priorities. What it also does is help stakeholders make the case for the value that they're going to get from, thank you, Olga, from Moscow. It also helps the stakeholders make the case for the value that they're going to get from this requirement. So what I've found is if we go high, medium, or low, or use the Moscow technique, then stakeholders have a natural inclination to categorize everything as high or everything as a must-have requirement. And the reason that they do that is because history has shown them that these projects run over and the phase 2 gets cut. And so there isn't any time to do the medium priority requirements, or they could have requirements. Those requirements never see the light of day. So stakeholders have been trained to inflate the priority of everything. This technique forces them not to do that, to rank them in order. So using those techniques together by avoiding big fat contingencies, and instead by using things like user stories and relative estimation, incremental funding and iterative development, and ranked prioritization, we can reduce uncertainty pretty dramatically, not completely, but we go, instead of something looking like a glass of Sauvignon Blanc, we end up with something that looks much more like a perfect Patron Tequila margarita. I'm going at quite a pace. There's a good 50 minutes of content in here, and I want to leave some time for questions, but anybody have any questions or thoughts before we move into the main meat, the user story mapping method? All right, we'll charge on. Okay, so we're going to look at a technique called user story mapping. It helps us to visualize the scope, the timeline, the resources, and the costs of our business application. Now, user story mapping was devised by a guy called Jeff Patton about 15 years ago, a bit longer, 1993. I think his book was put in 1995. So yeah, it's at least 15 years old. What I've done is I've taken Jeff Patton's user story mapping technique and enhanced it a little bit with some estimation things on the end of it to really apply that to Microsoft Business Applications projects. It's worked really well for me on at least a dozen projects over the last couple of years, and I want to share some of those with you. So I'm going to take you through the technique and then show you some real life examples. There are 8 steps to building a user story map. The first step is assembling the right team. So back at Jurassic World, we have our discovery, or we had our discovery team, but really what we didn't have there was somebody like Claire. So Claire is our business leader. She is the single person who's going to be accountable for the value generated by our application. She's got the vision, the business expertise, she's got the commitment to our application and the availability to act as our product owner. So she's the single person who's going to be accountable. We didn't have that before. The rest of the team are made up of subject matter experts and analysts, a bit like the discovery team we had before, but now we're adding in some of the technologists. We are not going to throw things over the wall later to them. They're going to be involved right at the start of the project. So we've got developers and testers and integration folks and functional consultants all involved in our story mapping team as well as some of the business subject matter experts. And if you're working with a Microsoft partner, you can bring them in at this stage as well, particularly in this case at Jurassic World, where our Microsoft partner is a field service expert. So we've got our team assembled. The next thing we need to do is to help our team understand our product goal. So it's going to be Claire's responsibility as the product owner to help the team understand her vision for this application. And she can either write it herself and present it to the team, but what Claire wanted to do was to involve the team, get them involved in describing the value that this application is going to bring to the organization. So they went through a bit of a brainstorming exercise. They spent a few minutes writing some ideas down under those headings, so the users, their aims, the needs that they had, the value that they would get, and the features that they would need. And when they distilled all of that into one phrase, this was the product goal that they came up with. Park rangers, managers, and subcontractors want to reduce costs by outsourcing more asset maintenance. And to achieve this, we are building a robust asset maintenance application that will result in more working assets and reduced operating costs by scheduling competitive jobs. So now everybody knows what we're building, why we're building it, and whenever we need to make difficult trade-offs during the development process, we can refer back to this product goal and know which one of the options in front of us is going to align best with that goal. Next step is personas, understanding who it is we're building the application for. You can call them user roles if you like, but personas is slightly broader than just user roles because a lot of the stakeholders who give us requirements are not always going to be users of the application, especially when it comes to non-functional requirements. Those can come from industry regulators, government departments, your board of directors or external auditors, maybe third-party business partners that you're working with. Could come from your IT department, particularly IT security or operations, or from other systems that need to integrate with our Microsoft business application. So personas, you can think of as user roles, but not all personas are going to be actual types of users. Here is an example of a persona that is a user role. I like to describe my persona through those three values, the context, the characteristics, and the criteria. So what the team did at Jurassic World, they brainstormed about 40 different persona, threw them up on a whiteboard, on sticky notes, and then went through a grouping exercise to try and consolidate that down. And if PowerPoint's going to play, yep, there we go. We ended up with 9 persona in 4 different groups, and they summarized the primary goal for each user role. So we have a director of the park service, a lot of park ranger type people, some maintenance type people, and then a couple of back office staff, the asset manager and the system administrator who wants to stop swearing at the users. Next step is to define our scope. And we touched on user stories earlier. User stories are a great way of defining the scope, but user stories are a little bit detailed. So we're going to step up a level and use something called epic user stories. If you've worked with user stories for any length of time, you probably know what an epic is already. Just a reminder then that a user story is not a specification for a requirement. It's a reminder that there is a requirement. If your user story is 6 pages of scenarios and tests, and then you've probably gone too far. I like to have a nice short title, a user story statement, and if you need to, maybe a couple of behavior-driven design scenarios, but try not to write it as a specification. It needs to get printed and signed and approved, and then you're back to requirement specification. You don't have to use this template, but this is a really popular template, and it can be useful if you're getting started with user stories. As a user role, I can do some feature so that I achieve my goal. Let's look at an example. As a maintenance manager, I can create a work order to coordinate and schedule resources so that our customers received prompt service and we optimize our resource utilization. So there's an example of one of the user stories in the Jurassic World backlog. And here's a couple more. So like I said, we're going to give them an identifier, 1, 2, 3, and a short title. I don't want to read out the entire user story. When I say, hey, what are you working on, Fred? Fred can just say, hey, I'm working on the transfer inventory story, and I know exactly which one he means. I also don't want people reading, I'm working on story number 3. That's not so helpful. So short titles are good. And if we think about the structure of the requirements, we've got some themes that we're going to be working on. Those themes can be broken down into epic user stories, and then the epic user stories get broken on into smaller, much more implementable sized user stories. So I like working at the epic level when I'm doing user story mapping. We could have 10 epics. I've worked on initial product backlogs where there's 100 epics. That was a big multi-year program, but it's in that kind of range. 10, 20, maybe 50 epics is pretty common. We don't want to work with hundreds or even thousands of user stories. So we want to stay at that epic level. Which reminds me a lot of the old asteroids game. I don't know if you're as old as I am and remember, it's an arcade game from the 1970s or 80s. We had a little spaceship in the middle of the screen and you could shoot these asteroids. As you shot the asteroids, they'd splinter into smaller and smaller rocks. Well, in the asteroids game, if you broke up all the big rocks into little tiny rocks, you'd get crushed pretty quickly because these little rocks fly around the place super fast and they'd smash your spaceship. What you want to do is take one of the big rocks, shoot it, split it up into smaller rocks, and then shoot all the small rocks before starting on one of the big rocks again. Much more manageable way to deal with asteroids, and it's exactly the same when we're working with requirements. Take one of our big epics, leave it as an epic until we're ready to work on it, and then we start breaking it down into smaller and smaller chunks. So that's the epic kind of level user stories that we're working with. What the team did is they went through all of their persona, or the 4 groups of persona, and imagined their epics. And they came up with these 13 different epics. There is another way to ensure that you've got everybody's requirements covered off. Having all the persona there is a really good way of saying, have I considered everybody? If you have, then there's a good chance that you've captured almost all of your requirements. Another way to do it, which is Jeff Patton's original way of doing it, is to take a more business process oriented story map. And if you're focusing on just a single business process, you can sketch out the major business process activities and then have epics arranged underneath that as the major tasks in your business process. Again, this gives us some reassurance that we've covered all the activities in our business process, and therefore we haven't got any missing requirements, which is one of the problems of a traditional Agile product backlog. It's just a big ordered list. It's really hard to know if it's complete, and there's always a sneaking feeling that you've missed somebody out. Next stage is our estimation stage. This is where it gets exciting. This is the, it's a bit like the shampoo commercial. This is the science bit where I explain how coenzyme Q will make your estimates look really youthful. We're going to use what's known as a modified Fibonacci sequence and a game called Planning Poker to estimate our epics. I like using story points to estimate my stories and my epics. And a story point is just an arbitrary unit of measure that can be used to estimate the relative size of 2 things. Good way of thinking about it is, so my wife and I go trail running around a local mountain here in Brisbane called Mount Cootha, and she's a much better runner than me. So if she says that we're going to go on a 1-hour trail, well, she runs that trail in an hour. That's why she calls it a 1-hour trail, but I'm slower than her and it's going to take me an hour and a half. So we don't have a common language for the types of trail that we're going to run. So what we do instead is describe the trail in kilometers. And so we say it's a 6K trail. Trail running can be a little bit difficult, right? So it's a lot of uphills, or you've got a ravine to cross, or there's a bridge or similar challenge, you've got to run through a swamp. Then you might want to adjust the size of the trail based on that risk or complexity. And we could do exactly the same thing with our requirements. Instead of estimating them in hours or days, because developers go at different speeds, we can estimate them using story points, which is just like kilometers. And we can add in a little bit of a factor to anticipate any risk. So if we have a requirement to use Azure Service Bus for the first time, or we're going to be working with function locations and asset trees and Dynamics 365 field service, and we've never done that before, or we're going to be relying on Adobe to help us integrate with Adobe Campaign, and there's a dependency there that might give us some risk, then we can adjust our estimates accordingly. Story points, great unit of measure for estimating your epics, and I like using this scale 13, 20, 40, 60, and 100. And we're going to play a game called Planning Poker. To do that, the first thing we need to do before we play Planning Poker is to agree our baseline. So a baseline, normally for me, I like to pick a 20-point epic, which is one of the epics that our team thinks is fairly well understood. It's certainly not the biggest requirement. It's probably towards the smaller end, and we have got a good handle on it, and we think we could easily implement that epic in a couple of sprints. Anything smaller than that is going to be a 13. If it's a lot smaller than that, you know, if we think the story is 5 or 6 points, then we'd group some of those requirements together until they're epic kind of sized. Similarly, if it's more than 100 points, then we're going to split that super epic up. That would be a theme. We're going to split that up until it's somewhere in that 13 to 100 point range. So like working with this range for estimating epics. Planning Poker. It's a fun game. All the family can play it. You get to keep your clothes on in most cases. It's a gamified technique for a team to reach the consensus about the size of the requirements in their backlog. One of the things it does is it avoids us anchoring our estimates based on what somebody else has already estimated. So we all secretly, privately estimate on a card, or take a card out of our hand that we think represents the size of the user story or the epic that's been described, and we all reveal our cards at the same time. If we haven't reached consensus in the first go, I normally ask the player with the highest and the lowest estimates to describe why they think it's that size, and then we play again until we reach consensus. That way we get buy-in from all the developers, and it's only the developers who are doing the estimation. It's not the subject matter experts, it's not the Scrum Master or the product owner. It's our analysts, it's our testers, it's our developers, it's our functional consultants who are doing that estimating. What the Jurassic World team did is estimate the 13 epics that they had, and they came up with a total of 573 points. So that's step 5 in our 8-step story mapping process complete. We now have an estimated backlog. Next, we're going to prioritize this and sort those epics out into releases. So what we need to do is to consider, first of all, which requirements are absolutely necessary to release into production. And that will be different for different applications because it depends on what you're starting with. If you've got a bunch of complex spreadsheets, well, then you might be able to release a Power App with relatively few features pretty quickly. If you're replacing legacy Oracle ERP system with Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, well, you're going to deliver a lot of features before you can retire Oracle. I haven't met a CIO who wants us to deliver accounts payable this year and accounts receivable next year. That's not going to fly. So the size of that initial release will depend upon the features that you need in that first release. Depends on what you're replacing. The concept of a minimum viable product has been around for a while. There's a lot of different definitions, though. I think the minimum viable product is not something you're going to release into production. It's something you're going to release into a sandbox or non-production environment and have users test and give you feedback on. It's not your first release you're going to put into production. That feedback is absolutely necessary, but a skateboard's not going to cut it. Claire has decided that something more analogous to the trail bike is what she has called the minimum releasable product. So it's got sufficient features that we can retire our existing application. It's a bit more sophisticated than the scooter or the bike or the skateboard. Those steps along the way were necessary, but they weren't worth putting into production. After the minimum releasable product, Claire's got some enhancements in mind in future releases. And so what that looks like is release 1 with our highest value epics in it. Release 2 contains the next set of highest value epics, and release 3 has got a couple of nice to have features that can be delivered later. Now let's think about the costs. We know what we're going to release. We know the effort in each release. Now we need to figure out how much it's going to cost for each release and for the project as a whole. And the costs of building the application are almost entirely based upon the people, the resources that are going to be building it. In this case, Jurassic World has got a customer team with some people on that side, and they're working closely with a Microsoft partner who's got some consultants on their side. So we've got a product owner and a business analyst, an integration architect, and so on. And the partner's delivering a project director who's a part-time resource. They've got a scrum master, a couple of functional consultants, and so on. And I'm using the abbreviation FTE here to mean a full-time equivalent. You can see there the project director is maybe only working for 1 day a week on this project. And so that's 0.2 full-time equivalents. And if you know exactly who's going to be involved and what their costs are, you can go pretty accurate on this. But for the purposes of this illustration, I'm just going to say we've got a total of 12.6 FTEs. They work 30 hours a week on average on this project. The other hours of the week taken up by personal leave and bank holidays and working on other projects and working on support tasks and those kinds of things. And if we say that the average person here has a fully loaded cost of $100 an hour, might be more, might be less in Perth, I'm not sure, then imagine each resource in our team is going to have an average cost of $3,000 per week. Hopefully you're following the math so far. So what does that look like from a project duration and costs perspective? So we have estimated the project backlog to have 573 story points. Next, we're going to estimate how many story points will complete in a 2-week sprint. And this is a critical estimate for the team, but the Microsoft partner has done this quite a lot before. Using this kind of team, they think they can achieve 40 points per sprint. That's also known as their velocity. So back to the trail running, that's the speed that we run at. So therefore, if you divide one by the other, the project is going to take about 15 sprints. Each sprint is 2 weeks, so that's 30 weeks in total. Now, we said earlier on that each person on the team costs $3,000 a week. There's 12.6 people, so that's $37,800 per week. So the total project cost, if you run that for 30 weeks, it's going to be $1.134 million. And the useful way of thinking about that is that equates to almost $2,000 per point. That's a critical number for your product owner to know, because now she can look at each of the requirements and go, I wonder if that's really worth $40,000, or that one's really worth $200,000. She can look at those epics and use the cost per point to maybe adjust the priority. Once you know how much it's going to cost, your perspective on what's important can often change. Sorry about that, everybody. My computer just completely froze. All right, let's try and pick this up from where we left off. Just through all the slides. I love having lots of slides in my presentations, but if you need to pick up from where you left off, it's a lot of just to go through. Here we go. Let's go sharing again. Okay, this time I'm just going to share my screen rather than do the live PowerPoint bit. There we go. Okay, so thank you very much for your patience, everybody. We're back. So what we've done is we've applied our estimates to each of the releases. So you can see there, release 1, it's got 240 points. So that's going to take about 6 sprints over 12 weeks. Total cost is $453,600. Release 2 is slightly smaller, but it's when you round it all off, it's still the same number of sprints, 6 sprints, 12 weeks, same kind of cost. Release 3 is quite a bit smaller, it's 113 points. So if you divide that by our velocity, then it's going to take 3 sprints, takes 6 weeks, and cost $226,000. And that's how we arrived at our total cost of $1.134 million. So you can see that there is a little bit of contingency because we're rounding off to the nearest sprint. So that does give us a little bit of wiggle room in our estimates. And the final thing we're going to do is to share our story map with our stakeholders. So it looks like this. We've got our product goal across the top. We've got our persona or user roles there as well in yellow. And aligned under each of those, we've got the epic user stories that each of those user roles are going to benefit from. And then we've sliced those horizontally into releases, release 1, 2, and 3. And then down at the bottom, just for the benefit of the stakeholders, we've got some totals. Number of points, number of sprints, number of weeks, and dollars. Dennis was delighted with the user story map, and his CFO was delighted as well. The project got approved. Release 1 went really well, and release 2 and release 3 also got funded. Everybody lived happily ever after. Dennis never did get eaten by a dinosaur, and he retired successfully at the end of last year. Well done, Dennis. So just before we close out, I'm happy to take some questions, and I'm happy to stay on if you've got time as well. I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of examples of real user story maps from my projects. So I use both kind of post-it note user story maps and digital ones as well. I'll show you examples of both. This is an example of an early one I did a couple of years ago with a financial services company who were deploying Adobe Campaign and integrating that into Dynamics 365. So you can see the persona in pink across the top, the major steps of their business process, and then the epic user stories in yellow. And down at the bottom left in green, there is a bunch of assumptions and questions that we had that we needed to sort out before we could estimate this and move forward. This second example is another physical user story map. This is from RACQ, which was a project I worked on over the last couple of years. And we had this massive big wall in a conference room with lots of notes and cards stuck on the wall. So at the very top in the right-hand corner, you can probably just see a couple of purple cards. That's the level 2 business processes. Just underneath that is in yellow are the business process activities, the level 3. Underneath that in white are the epics. And then as we schedule those into sprints, so we're not just using releases, but actually which sprint are we going to deliver the work in, those begin to get delivered towards the bottom half of this wall. Like I said, it was a pretty big wall. It's over 2 meters tall and it's about 10 meters wide. It wrapped around 2 walls in this conference room. And it was a great place for us to bring all the stakeholders together every couple of weeks to revise, to let them know about the progress that we'd made, and also help them revise the plan for the next couple of sprints as well. So it was a really good way of getting everybody onto the same page. And as things got a little bit tight towards the end, we sometimes had to deprioritize a requirement and we drop it right down to the very bottom, meaning it wasn't going to get done. So if it was on the skirting board, it meant it was out of scope, probably. And here's that same user story map as a digital story map using a tool called Stories on Board, which I really like. It's been a brilliant application for user story mapping, and you can visit customary.com/SOB and get a 30-day free trial. It integrates really well with Trello and Jira and Azure DevOps. So whatever flavor of Agile work management tool you prefer, it works really well. I love it. Here's another digital user story map. Again, it's in Stories on Board. This was for a super fund. They have their persona across the top, advisors, employers, strategic partners, the digital team, customer and marketing team, and the membership management team with their epics, and then so the business process activities and the epics. And they had three, they called them tranches planned: technical proof of concept, then tranche 2 was a CRM for intermediaries, tranche 3 was going to be CRM for members, and then some stuff they just couldn't see the value in, so they called it unscheduled. Those are the cards down at the bottom. And this is another one for a government agency here in Queensland. We built the user story map. You can see that on the left in Stories on Board. And then we estimated the kind of team we could assemble. And this is a hybrid team with this government agency plus a Microsoft partner. There's going to be about 20 people in the team. And then we estimated the costs. And you can see the spreadsheet down at the bottom. And what I like doing, this is an example of a high velocity estimation and a lower velocity estimation. So what's the range of velocity that we think this team could perform at over the course of the project? And that gives us a range of costs. You can see here it works out at $3.84 to $5.28 million. We're not going to give people costs to the nearest penny. I think that kind of level of precision is misleading. You can see here it's a fairly large range, which reflects the ambiguity and the uncertainty at the beginning of a project. So I've been Neil Benson. I still am Neil Benson. Happy to take any questions about user story mapping, about estimating business applications, about planning poker, or whatever you might have. Bring it on. Love to see how I can help. Thanks very much.